So, what are the most beautiful cities in North America? Now, a lot of people would say that the cities of North America don't stack up to the cities of Europe in terms of beauty. And I would say that is true in many cases. But some of the ones near the top of the list, I think, honestly, are pretty beautiful in their own right. And furthermore, even if it's like the expression, if you can't be with the one you love, then love the one you're with. And I think in North America, even if we don't have anything that's quite at the level of Rome or Prague or Venice, I think we do have some cities that are very beautiful in their own right. And furthermore, if you're somebody who's from North America and you feel especially an attachment to your heritage or to North American history, you get a sense of personal connection in some of these places that I think you don't necessarily get quite as much in Europe or maybe in another continent either. Now, one caveat, when I'm talking about most beautiful cities, obviously I'm a fan of traditional architecture. So these are going to be cities that have a lot of, or at least a moderate amount of traditional architecture. I don't like modernist architecture, so how allegedly beautiful or not beautiful the modernist architecture is doesn't factor into the equation for me. I think it's all crap. And also, these cities are all on the list for architectural beauty as opposed to natural beauty. Like I find when looking at cities, it's architectural beauty that matters because natural beauty is something I would more associate with the countryside. But I'll give an honorable mention to Vancouver because it does have immense natural beauty in its surroundings, and you can see the mountains from downtown, which is pretty cool. But architecturally speaking, I wouldn't say Vancouver is that great. It has a few beautiful buildings here and there, but nothing spectacular, nothing to write home about. So, yeah, honorable mention to Vancouver for beautiful nature nearby. And yeah, when I'm talking about beautiful cities, I am talking about United States and Canada. I'm not talking about Mexico in a North American context. Some people like to lump Mexico in, but I don't because I see Mexico as more part of Latin America, like in a socio-political sense, not North America. So yeah, there's gonna be 14 on this list. Bit of an odd number. Well, technically even, but odd because most people would round it off to 15. But I think these 14 sort of stand out among larger cities. And yeah, I'm doing cities that are above 500,000 in the metropolitan area because you gotta make a cutoff threshold somewhere. So yeah. Number 14 is San Francisco. Now, a lot of people would put it higher, but personally, when I went to San Francisco, I wasn't that impressed. I mean, it has some nice Victorian architecture, but overall, I mean, you can really tell that, I mean, I'm pretty sure the city was totally devastated in the 1906 earthquake. And yeah, there's not a whole ton of like architecture that appears to be older than that. What there is, some of it's fairly nice, but I wouldn't rank it among the top cities. Like there is some nice Victorian architecture in San Francisco. And to be honest, what drags it down also a bit is just the scumminess of the city. Like there's so much degeneracy and degradation. It just I don't know. But I will give it does deserve a place on the list because it is frankly the only city in the western half of the continent that does have that like dense, walkable, historic or at least semi-historic big city feel. And I guess that in and of itself, I mean there are some nice buildings like the Painted Ladies. Is that what it's called? Those houses that are near the park. But yeah, San Francisco overall, I think it's actually a bit overrated. I didn't find it especially spectacular in an architectural sense. There's definitely nice Victorian architecture, but I don't think anything that's quite on the level as the cities higher on this list. So number 13 is Toronto. Now, obviously, I'm a bit biased because I'm from the Toronto area. But at the same time, I mean, I think Toronto does have a wealth of beautiful architecture if you know where to look. Like Cabbagetown in particular is a very beautiful historic Victorian neighborhood. And there's other neighborhoods like the Annex, Harvard Village that have similar architecture. Not to mention in the downtown, there's one really beautiful Art Deco building, which is, I believe, the CIBC building. It has a quite spectacular lobby, although you can't always get in there. Very cool architecture on the side of the building too. Like there's a bunch of faces if you look at the top of the tower, which is pretty cool. I think it was built in the 1890s. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, it's an older skyscraper. Union Station's also pretty cool if you are lucky enough to get there when it's not under construction, which it usually is. Casa Loma is also quite beautiful. It's like a palatial estate built in the style of a European castle. I believe it was built in the 1910s. I'm not sure, or definitely early 20th century. University of Toronto also has some beautiful Gothic style buildings, kind of in the vein of universities in Glasgow and Edinburgh. I think Glasgow in particular. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like kind of medium density Victorian style housing that surrounds the downtown area. Like the downtown area itself is mostly modernist, like high rise skyscrapers. And I think where you really find a lot of beautiful architecture is in the areas surrounding it. It's just, unfortunately, I think the city's a bit too lenient with granting people permits to modify, alter, or destroy these historic homes and replace them with modernist homes or modernist additions. But nonetheless, despite that, there's still quite a bit of, quite a number of neighborhoods in Toronto that have beautiful architecture to check out. So, I mean, I'd say it's definitely worth a visit if you're going to Niagara Falls, for instance, like it's nearby. So yeah, Toronto's number 13. Number 12 is Ottawa. Now, Ottawa's, one of its main draws is the Parliament buildings, but if you're going for that, I would not recommend going now because they're under renovation, and they're going to be under renovation for quite a long time. I hope they eventually reopen and that they didn't completely ruin the interior. I don't know what they're doing there, but when I was there, yes, the Parliament buildings are quite beautiful inside and out. Of Gothic style, very British looking. They're quite impressive. Like the Peace Tower in particular, but really the whole complex. Like it's, and the Library of Parliament. In addition to the Parliament buildings, there's also Chateau Laurier, although I don't appreciate what they're doing with the expansion. I really hate that. They're just adding a modernist, ugly portion onto it and ruining the back end of it. Notre Dame Cathedral, very beautiful interior. The exterior is like somewhat beautiful, but a bit ordinary looking. Like it's still historic, but like nothing terribly ornate. But then you go inside and it's actually extremely ornate. And yeah, definitely French Canadian style, similar to Notre Dame de Montreal. Yeah, so those buildings are some of the main draws in Ottawa. I would say in terms of like neighborhoods to walk around in, it's not the greatest city. Like the main draw in Ottawa architecturally is the monumental buildings like the ones I just mentioned. But yeah, those buildings are absolutely spectacular. Also, there's good views of the Parliament buildings from the Quebec side if you look across the river, like of the back of the Parliament buildings. So yeah, Ottawa, I would say most of the architecturally spectacular buildings are concentrated in a very specific area near the Ottawa River, like near the Parliament buildings. But yeah, for those buildings alone, it earns that spot on the list. Next is Chicago at number 11. Chicago definitely has a wealth of Art Deco skyscrapers. There's a lot of them specifically around the Michigan Avenue Bridge, which I've filmed several videos there in the past. Very beautiful skyscrapers, some of the best anywhere for like the Art Deco neo-Gothic vibe. They have some nice lobbies too, although sometimes the security there don't like people coming in and taking a look. I've had different reactions. Although to be fair, I was dressed very differently each time, so it's kind of an interesting social experiment. Yeah, the second time I probably looked a bit more sketchy and I got very different reactions than the first time. Like as soon as I walk in, can I help you? Is there anything you're looking for? Can I help you find anything? You know, that kind of hostile helpfulness, you know. But yeah, Chicago also has a lot of great museums that are beautiful buildings in and of themselves. As I captured in one of my videos, Museum of Science and Industry has a very nice pond next to it and great views of the museum from across the pond. And yeah, Grant Park, Buckingham Fountain is absolutely gorgeous. And there's also some beautiful old style skyscrapers like Art Deco era lining Michigan Avenue next to the park. So yeah, I mean, also the Chicago Board of Trade building is pretty cool. It's another Art Deco skyscraper. It was the one in the Dark Knight, in the scene where Batman flips the transport truck and you see this big skyscraper in the background, this big imposing Art Deco skyscraper. That's that one, the Chicago Board of Trade building. Also, some of the elevated train stations are pretty cool. They have this very like rustic kind of look to them. This kind of like gritty steampunk look. Yeah, Chicago, I mean, there's a lot of modernist stuff interspersed among the historic buildings, but a lot of the historic buildings are quite unique to Chicago. Well, I guess New York City has similar stuff also, but yeah, relatively unique. So yeah, Chicago earns the number 11 spot there. You know what? I am so sorry. I am going to have to take that back. I forgot a city that should have been a bit lower on the list. Baltimore. Yes, Baltimore, I think, should actually be number 13 between Toronto and Ottawa. No, wait. Toronto was number 13. Ottawa was 12. Okay, so Baltimore should be 12. Ottawa 11, Chicago 10. Okay, so let me backtrack here. Baltimore at number 12. Now Baltimore obviously has a bad rap because it has a high crime rate, and it's not a city that I would recommend just exploring in a way where it's like you're kind of just walking on random streets. I would say in Baltimore, you have to be very conscious of what neighborhood you're in and don't go outside the neighborhoods that are relatively safe. When I went there, the neighborhoods I explored were Fells Point and Mount Vernon, and those are both quite nice neighborhoods. Like Fells Point has a very colonial vibe. It's on the harbor. It's quite beautiful, wealthy neighborhood by inner city Baltimore standards. It doesn't have a sketchy vibe like much of the city does. Mount Vernon also, it's a nice area with a beautiful monument in the middle of it and a park. It's kind of forms like a cross shape, the park that surrounds the monument, with some nice historic buildings around it. I would guess probably early 20th century, but I'm not sure. Or maybe late 19th. But yeah, Baltimore, I would say the downtown itself isn't quite as nice. Like a lot of the nicer areas surround the downtown. I've heard Federal Hill is also a nice area for historic architecture. It's just, again, in Baltimore, you have to be very careful about where you are. And as much as I hate to say it, there are some neighborhoods that probably also have, that do also have beautiful historic architecture, but are heavily decaying and just not safe and partially abandoned in some cases. It's really sad. Like the types of places you see on The Wire. But there are some nice neighborhoods in Baltimore that are relatively safe. I mean, I don't know. Is anywhere in Baltimore totally safe? Probably not. But, relatively safe neighborhoods. But yeah, Baltimore probably would have the potential to be higher on this list if they clean the city up a bit, because there are a lot of historic homes in the city. It's just a lot of these neighborhoods I cannot with good conscience recommend anybody go to. But of the ones that you still can, there are still some nice areas to check out. So yeah, Baltimore is number 12. And on to number 9, since I've had to backtrack here a bit. Number 9 is Montreal. Now, what's great about Montreal is especially the Vieux Port, the old port. One of the oldest neighborhoods in Canada, and one of the few old neighborhoods in North America that doesn't have a grid pattern, and that's when you know it's a really old area. Like I think the only areas that are so old that you have the gosh, I forget the name, like organic street pattern as opposed to a grid street pattern, which is kind of more like the really old European neighborhoods. I think the only ones where you have that is the old port in Montreal, the old city in Quebec City, and Beacon Hill and the North End in Boston, and then arguably Greenwich Village in New York City. But yeah, those would be the only ones like that. And yeah, so the Old Port in Montreal is one of those neighborhoods. A lot of gray stone architecture that's very historic. The Notre Dame Cathedral there is absolutely gorgeous, especially the interior. I would say it's the most beautiful cathedral interior in all of North America. Quite spectacular, very unique and original. Like the vibe that it gives is almost more like a bar or nightclub than a church. And they do have like light shows there at night. That would be cool to see. I haven't seen that, but yeah. It's very beautiful cathedral. To be honest, I almost feel like the cathedral in Montreal, the interior, would actually be even more suitable for New Orleans than Montreal if it had been built there, but it wasn't. So it's in Montreal. So take that for what it's worth. But yes, both, and again, both cities with French heritage, obviously. So that's a commonality there. So yeah, Montreal, it was tough. I was debating, should it be number 8 or 9, but I put it at number 9 because the next city that I have at number 8, I think, surpasses it, if just barely, which is Philadelphia at number 8. Philadelphia has a wealth of colonial American architecture, a lot of beautiful red brick buildings like row houses, some alleys, some very narrow alleys with beautiful buildings, like colonial era row houses. And yeah, that's the main draw of Philadelphia. There's also some historic sites like Independence Hall. Yeah, just very beautiful sections of the city in the core city if you like historic colonial American style architecture. I'm not sure how much of the architecture in Philadelphia is actually from the colonial era and how much is like colonial styles but from later on. But either way, like it does very strongly have that vibe in the city, in the center areas of the city. So yeah, Philadelphia, very beautiful for colonial style architecture. Number 7. Number 7 is Washington, D.C. Now here's where it starts getting tough because I'm getting to like the ones that are really high on the list. And Washington, D.C. has some of the most beautiful like classical style architecture outside of Europe. Like much of the city, like it has very much like the mall area and the surrounding area. There's a lot of like Greco-Roman influence. A lot of it's very like neoclassical. Like there's definitely that stately European vibe. A lot of white buildings. It's kind of reminiscent of Vienna a little bit with the predominance of white classical style buildings. Like obviously there's the Capitol, the White House. There's an area called the Federal Triangle that is right next to the mall that has a lot of gorgeous buildings. And of course there's all the museums that make up the Smithsonian. Most of them are historic style buildings, although a few of them are modernist. Kind of ruin the view a little bit, although not totally, but a little bit. Obviously there's the monuments too, like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. Also, Georgetown is quite a beautiful neighborhood. I'm not sure what era, like early 20th century, late 19th, I would guess. A lot of beautiful old homes. And yeah, the Library of Congress, that's also a beautiful building in Union Station. So yeah, I would say in DC, like the beauty of the city is concentrated around the mall area and nearby. Also, Alexandria is a beautiful old town that's within the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Definitely worth checking out. Like I would say the architecture in Alexandria is kind of an interesting sort of halfway point between the more southern styles of like Charleston and Savannah versus like the more northern colonial styles that are typical of like Philadelphia, Boston, etc. So yeah, Alexandria is an interesting historic city for that reason too. But yeah, DC at number 7. Now this is get where it gets really tough. I'm gonna put Boston at number 6. Boston is a very beautiful city. A lot of like very colonial style, like red brick architecture, especially in the neighborhoods of Beacon Hill and the North End. Some also in the South End neighborhood and Back Bay. Charleston on the other side, Charlestown on the other side of the river or bay. I'm not sure. Other side of the body of water. Let's put it that way. Harvard University has some beautiful buildings too, although they don't always let you go inside them. But yeah, Boston is probably the best city for like colonial style American architecture. The old State House is quite a beautiful building, and also some of the old churches. Again, as I've said many times, it goes to show that even when the Puritans tried to make buildings like simple and unfancy, they still looked beautiful in their own way because it was just hard to build anything ugly back then. You couldn't do it even if you tried. Whereas with modern materials, it's hard to build something beautiful even if you try. So yeah, the irony of Puritan architecture still being beautiful in spite of like an ideological opposition toward overt ostentatiousness and fanciness. But yeah, Boston, yeah, very, very great city for colonial style architecture. Oh, the Massachusetts State Hall is also a beautiful building, State House. Yeah, but unfortunately, the West End of Boston was another beautiful neighborhood that was destroyed in the 1960s for the sake of redevelopment, which was common at the time. I think it was, yeah, 50s, 60s, yeah. But there's still a lot of neighborhoods like that still left. And yeah, Boston all around like gives very British vibes, very colonial era vibes. All around, it's probably like yeah, the prototypical colonial American city. So number 5 is New York City. Now some would question its placement this high. Yes, New York City does have a lot of modernist architecture also, but what places New York City so high is sheer quantity and variety. It probably has more historic architecture in terms of just quantity than any other city in North America. In fact, I would say definitely. It would be probably pretty high on list of cities with the most historic architecture in the world in terms of like defining it as like anything that's like pre-World War II, pre-modernist styles, simply because it's just a very big city with a lot of neighborhoods, like a lot of like pre-World War II neighborhoods, not only in Manhattan Island, but in the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, even some of the cities or municipalities on the New Jersey side. But I mean, obviously, New York City is a winner in terms of quantity, but what about quality? Well, there are some places in New York City that I think are quite nice, like Greenwich Village, Soho, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, Harlem. Surprisingly enough, I know Harlem is like, it's a bit shady, but there is some very beautiful architecture there, like old brownstones. And yeah, like much of the city, like many of these residential neighborhoods, quite beautiful, like row houses and tenement buildings. Also, like around Chinatown and Little Italy. And also, there's a lot of Art Deco skyscrapers in downtown, like around Wall Street, and also in the Midtown area or near Central Park. Grand Central Station is quite spectacular also. And there's a few, like I'm not sure what the building is, but there's one building near Grand Central that's quite spectacular also. You see it in John Wick, in the first John Wick movie. I don't remember the name of the building offhand, but it's near Grand Central Station, and it forms a pretty spectacular streetscape, as well as the what's the building? The municipal building. I think it's near the city hall. It's one of these parks that is in Lower Manhattan. Yeah, that building is quite spectacular. Also, yeah, New York City it has a great wealth of historic buildings. It's just There's also some modernist crap that'll be interspersed here and there. Well, not just here and there, but plenty of it. But nonetheless, because of the sheer volume of historic architecture, and some of it actually is quite spectacular and quite unique, I do have to put New York quite high on the list. I mean, some would even argue it. I think there's arguments that it could be even higher on the list, but because it's not as consistently historic as some of the other cities, I'm putting it at number 5. Number 4 is Savannah. Now, Savannah has a very archetypically southern vibe to it, like thick Spanish moss lining the trees and the buildings. It's very southern Gothic. Uh, like, I'd say the most beautiful parts of Savannah are south of the downtown, like between the downtown and Forsyth Park. There's a lot of really beautiful historic residential neighborhoods, and it has a grid pattern with like each neighborhood has squares in it, and each square has like a park inside it, and there's different squares of different sizes, but it's laid out in a very like orderly geometric fashion. But yeah, it's a very beautiful city. The downtown area is a bit hit or miss, but then when you get past the downtown area toward the riverfront, there's some nice historic buildings around there, and some very like beautiful but at the same time grimy sections. Like if you go behind the riverfront buildings, there's these like alleyways that are kind of sketchy and gritty, but like still very historic. So kind of cool from that perspective, although it's not, I wouldn't want to be in these alleyways at night. They do have a very like sketchy vibe, but they're still kind of cool in that sense. But yeah, Savannah overall, very beautiful city. Very southern Gothic, very atmospheric. Highly recommended. Number 3 is Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Charleston, similar to Savannah in many ways, but I think feels a bit older. It has that very Mediterranean vibe. Like a lot of the buildings there wouldn't look out of place in Italy or Spain or southern France. Like just a lot of colorful, historic Mediterranean style architecture in the old town, mixed with like some of these like denser detached homes that are probably a bit newer, but still like probably 19th century. And yeah, a very, very southern vibe again. Very beautiful. So Charleston feels cleaner than a lot of cities. So if you want to go to a place that feels cleaner and safer, I would say it's a good bet. But yeah, overall, it's just a very beautiful historic city, very like Mediterranean kind of vibes, which is unusual for an American city. But yeah, Charleston, definitely all around recommended. Number 2 on the list is Quebec City. Now, again, what you're noticing about the ones high on the list is they all tend to have French heritage. I don't know to what extent the French built the architecture in all these cities, but I do know Quebec City was very much built by the French. And yeah, very historic. A lot of old buildings, I think like 18th century, 19th century, even 17th century. It has a more Northern European vibe. Like it's simultaneously French, but Northern in terms of the overall vibe the architecture gives off. Like I would say reminiscent of some places in Northern France, like smaller towns or medium-sized city. It doesn't have a big city feel. Well, it isn't really a huge city. It is like kind of like 600,000, 700,000 in the metropolitan area. So more similar to Charleston and Savannah in size. But Quebec City is very safe. It's one of the safest cities in North America. You can probably guess why. If you look at the demographics, it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together there. But yeah, very safe, very low crime rate, and gorgeous city. I mean, it's in my avatar here on my YouTube channel, the Chateau Frontenac, which looms over the city very majestically. Gorgeous landmark building. The Winter Carnival's cool, but it gets really fucking cold then, so I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. I would say if you're seeing the city for the first time, I probably wouldn't go in the winter. But But it could be cool if you've already been there and you'd like to go to the Winter Carnival to experience it. Although, who fucking knows with global warming, how much longer is it going to be viable there? Are they going to have to move it to Shibugamu? Who knows? But yeah, when I was at the Winter Carnival like 10 years ago, it was really cold. But yeah, Quebec City overall, gorgeous, beautiful, charming, very European style. Like many have called it the most European style city in North America. It might be. I would say all the top three that I have on this list are very European style in the architecture. But yeah, Quebec City definitely, I would say the most reminiscent of like Northern European architecture. Like if you want that like storybook Northern European vibe that you get in many small, medium-sized towns in like Germany, Northern France, Austria, Switzerland, some parts of like Scandinavia or like the Baltic countries like Tallinn or somewhere like that. Like I would say Quebec City has that kind of vibe, the like northern continental Europe storybook kind of feel more than anywhere else in North America. So if that's the specific vibe you're looking for, Quebec City in North American terms is basically that's your city. Number one on the list is Nolens. Now, I did a whole video on Nolens, so I'm not gonna like talk about it in too much detail here. But I'm gonna say yes, the city does have a high crime rate, and concerns over that are 100% merited. But nonetheless, from an architectural standpoint, New Orleans to me is the number one in North America. It is just so gorgeous, so intricate, like the wrought iron balconies, the the ivy lining the buildings. Like it just has a very Mediterranean feeling, but also very unique. It feels Mediterranean, but it also feels like it has its own unique spin on Mediterranean styles. The only place I've seen architecture really similar to it in Europe is a few buildings in Nice, France. A few, not even like most of the buildings in Nice, but there's like three or four specific buildings that look very New Orleans style. But in and of itself, though, it is a very unique city. Very beautiful architecture, very atmospheric. Um, like I'd say it's the most atmospheric place in North America, and perhaps the most like un-North American place in North America. It really does feel like you're somewhere else. Like it doesn't feel like you're in an American city. It feels like its own thing, frankly. It is kind of a micro culture, as I covered also in my recent videos about endangered cultural groups with like the Cajun and Creole, like the Louisiana French culture that's like very unique to the area. And yeah, unique culture, unique food, unique architecture. But yeah, all things considered, I do think it's the most beautiful city in North America. The French Quarter, especially, but also some of the surrounding areas, like I think it's the Lower Garden District. I also think is a very underrated area, west of the French Quarter, west of the downtown. And yeah, like all in all, I think New Orleans is the number one in terms of like architectural beauty for North America. But it's a tight race, and honestly, a lot of these cities are quite spectacular. Unlike other lists I've done, like I have been to all these cities, so I am talking from experience. I've been to all these cities, and I've spent at least a day touring all of them. Well, actually, wait, that's not true. Baltimore, I spent really like a half day in, but yeah, otherwise, yeah, I've spent over a day in all these cities. So yeah, those are, in my opinion, the most beautiful cities in North America.